let me welcome those of you that are new. And before I do, having mentioned our manual, if you have not yet requested a copy, they are a PDF file that we will send you free of charge. If you will send an email to Ezra, E-Z-R-A, at stelijahokc.com. That's stelijahokc.com. And when you send your email, would you mind giving us your name and the city and state, or the city and country in which you are watching us? We just kind of like to keep track of that and remind ourselves, particularly during this COVID pandemic. You see, right now, Richard and I are the only ones in a room that normally would have had somewhere to 50 to 100 people participating live in this class with us. And so the fact that I mention your name and others' names during the week that have come and asked is just a way of reminding all of us we're not alone. And while we are each in our own homes, watching this privately, perhaps by ourselves, maybe with a spouse or some family members, it's nice to know that others are joining us simultaneously from other locations around the world. So this past week, we have heard from Kathy in Phoenix, Arizona, Tim in Dryden, New York, Raymond in the Ukraine, Barry in Birmingham, Alabama, Matt and Jessica in Mustang, Oklahoma, Derek in Orlando, Florida, Christo in Plovdiv, Bulgaria, Michael in Lexington, Kentucky, Yvonne in Wausau, Wisconsin, Jim in Cheowe, Missouri, and Natalie and Jeffrey in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. Welcome to each of you. We're glad that you're part of us. We're glad all of you are part of us as we begin this study together. Okay, chapter 4. We are still looking at the historical background and that within which the apocalypse of John sits. We have looked at a broad historical background of the Middle East, beginning way back several thousand years before Christ and coming forward to the present, to the first century, at the time that John is going to be writing the apocalypse. Today we're going to be looking at Alexander the Great, Daniel, and the Jews. So we are now beginning to focus closer. We've been generic of the whole, and the Jews are placed within it. Now let's begin to understand how the Jews interpreted and understood where they were in their lives and inside history. Now, some of you, I know, are ready to get out of all of this history, and I assure you we will at some point. We are getting closer. But most of us today are unaware that Christianity and Judaism, which are today two separate religions, originally were not separate religions. Judaism is not the mother of Christianity. Christianity and Judaism are siblings. They would be brother and sister, or two brothers. I guess you could say two sisters, out of the same background, from the same mother, following that metaphor, the metaphor of ancient Israel. And so we have, you see, a common background of messianic expectation inside Judaism, at least in the first century, and actually prior to the first century, within which Christianity represents part of the Messianic expectation part of ancient Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism would be a different sect or part or group inside ancient Judaism that did not get caught up in apocalypticism and Messianic expectation. And essentially, after the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD, there's only two sects inside Judaism that have survived into the future: Rabbinic Judaism and Christian Judaism. In approaching the apocalypse, we must remind ourselves, as we did in our opening chapters, in our opening episodes, that the apocalyptic literature is a genre peculiar to Judaism. Apocalypticism, apocalyptic literature, is a Jewish literary genre. It is something that is the product inside of Judaism and was used not only, therefore, by Christians, if we look at the book of Revelation, but it's used in the book of Revelation as a Jewish apocalyptic piece of literature. And so if we do not understand this common Jewish heritage in which Christianity has been grafted or comes out of Jewish Christianity, it is impossible to understand the apocalypse when we get to it. So that's what we're doing. We're getting to it, and I thank you for your patience. So let us get to it then. Alexander the Great in Jewish thought. It may come as a complete surprise to the non-Jewish that the non-Jewish Alexander the Great actually occupies a popular place inside Jewish literature. Alexander's impact on Jewish perception may be learned from the following fact. From among the wide variety of Greek names given to Jews by their own parents in antiquity, Antigonos, Aristobulos, Dosthesios, Menelaos, and Jason, to name a few of those popular Greek names that Jews used as a first name, Alexander's name remained popular long after the demise of Greek as a common language, the lingua franca, and it has remained in use inside Judaism to the present. Alexander the Great, a non-Jew's name. The ancient Israelites were the first to invent history. That is, they were the first to no longer just give a narrative, this happened, and then that happened, and then that happened, a sequence. They were the first to seek to find and give an understanding, to offer an understanding of what the narrative meant, the meaning of history, the meaning of a story. They were the first to look at and create a story to be told. The only version of Israelite history that does exist today is the Deuteronomist version, a written history begun 200 years before the father of a history, so-called, the Greek Herodotus. The Deuteronomist, and now we could say the Jewish perspective, sees world events as the manifestation of God's plan. After the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BC. The ancient Israelites lived as captives in Babylon until the Persians conquered Babylon in 539 BC, and Cyrus, the emperor of the Persians, permitted those Jews wishing to return to Judea to return in 516 BC. Ancient Israelite history ended when the captive Jews returned from Babylon, and Jewish history begins then in Palestine in 516 BC. Ancient Israelite history, now it's Jewish history. Cyrus and the Persian Empire had liberated the Israelites and let those Israelites who wished to do so to return to Judea. Cyrus, the Persian of the Persian Empire, is considered to have ended his empire. The Persian Empire is considered to have ended with the death of Alexander, who, in conquering Persia, nonetheless had welcomed Persians to be equal members of his new empire. The Persian Empire did not end with the death of Darius, the emperor of the Persians, but with the death of Alexander, who defeated Darius. The Persian Empire, from a Jewish perspective, ended with the death of Alexander, and with him, with the death of Alexander, the new empire that Alexander was creating, in which the Persians lived equally with the Greeks. With Alexander's death in 223 BC, the old world order in the eastern part of the inhabited world that was represented by Persian rule broke down and gave way to a number of competing Hellenistic kingdoms. For the Jews, this sudden break in political continuity called for a complete reevaluation of human history. You see, they had the Babylonians in 586. They've had the Persians begin in 516. They've let the Jews come home. And you're now at 323 years later. So from 586 to 323, we've had a continuous kind of stability in the world in which the Jews lived. That stability is going to be destroyed with the death of Alexander the Great, when his emperors begin fighting among themselves for control of his empire, especially the control of Persia, Babylon, Mesopotamia, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Palestine, and Greece. During this reevaluation, then, of what's going on, this collapse of peaceful historical continuity, as surprising as it may seem, thereafter, Alexander's name pops up repeatedly in the context of eschatological, end-time expectation. First of all, the connection of Alexander and Gog and Magog. Ezekiel was an Israelite prophet among those in captivity in Babylon after 586. His prophecies include the cleansing of Israel while it's in captivity. It includes the metaphor of the valley of dry bones, in which Israel will come back to life and be restored to be one nation with one king in Judah. These prophecies of cleansing and restoration are then followed by the cataclysmic prophecies of the great battle between Gog and God himself. So you've got chapter 36, we've got dry bones in chapter 37. Chapter 38 and 39 is about Gog and Magog. The prophecies of the new city and the new temple, the glory of the Lord in the temple, and God's entrance through the eastern gate all then follow after that in chapters 40 and 44. You have a sequence then of being cleansed, being able then to return the valley of dry bones, then the battle of Gog and Magog of end time, after which the rebuilding of the temple and the entering of God into his temple and reign is reestablished. In other words, in Ezekiel, the prophecy of God about Magog was an end-time battle after which Israel would live in peace. We thus see that in an that there will be an apocalyptic, sorry, I'm tongue-tied, apocalyptic battle between Gog and Israel, between Gog and God, that will precede the final and peaceful settlement of the nation of Israel. Now, a more elaborate, and by the way, I'm quoting Jewish scholars, wanting to understand from the Jewish perspective of how Judaism, out of which Christian Judaism will come, how Judaism itself understood the apocalyptic period, and it's its own invention of the genre of apocalyptic literature. A more elaborate picture, I'm quoting a Jewish scholar, appears in John's Revelation, beginning in chapter 20, verse 7, following. At the end of 1,000 years, Satan shall be released from his guards, assemble Gog and Magog, and march to the last battle. These three, together with the beast and the false prophet, Gog, Magog, the beast and the false prophets, shall be destroyed, and the judgment of the great white throne shall follow. Afterwards there will be the new heaven, the new earth, the new Jerusalem, and the coming of Christ. Perfectly Jewish history and apocalyptic expectation. Jewish historian Josephus, who was born in Jerusalem in 37 AD, was a living witness of the war between the Jews and Rome that resulted in the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jewish temple in 70 AD. The siege of Masada that began in 73 AD, and he died around 100 AD, as did the Apostle John. Both John and Josephus were eyewitnesses in Palestine to the events of the first century AD. Josephus completed his Antiquities of the Jews in 93 AD during the 13th year of Caesar Domitian's reign. The same time John is going to be writing his gospel and the apocalypse. At the time, Josephus was 56 years old. Josephus mentions both Magog and Alexander in his Antiquities history. He says the first mention of Magog is found in the book of Genesis, in which the grandsons of Noah are named. Genesis 10:2 says, the sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. In commenting on this passage, Josephus said this about Noah's son Japheth. Now they were the grandchildren of Noah, in honor whose names were imposed on the nations by those that first seized upon them. Japheth, the son of Noah, had 7 sons. They inhabited so that, beginning in the mountains of Taurus and Amanus, they proceeded along Asia as far as the river Tansis, and along Europe to Cadiz, and settling themselves on the lands which they light upon, which none had inhabited before them, and they called the nations by their own names. So across, if you will, let's just, if this, rather than trying to draw a map, let me just do it this way. If this represents the Atlantic, and this is going to represent India out here, and of course China, we are essentially describing what we will be talking about later. You have Persia. We're going to have Mesopotamia. Which is Babylon during this time period, Babylonia. You're going to have, now we're coming up to the Mediterranean world, and you're going to have here Turkey, which is divided into a half close to the Mediterranean and Greece, that it would be Asia and Asia Minor, 2 halves to it. Here's going to be the Jews in Palestine, and then of course we've got Egypt here. And if this represents Europe, so they've scattered across this northern tier here. We've still got a southern tier here, but they've scattered across this northern here region, or this central part of the globe. And they've settled across this, and they settled themselves that others had not been. And they called the nations by their own names. Gomer founded those whom the Greeks now call the Galatians. The Galati would have been here in central Turkey originally. Paul wrote a letter to the Galatians, who became the Gauls when they migrated to France, and the Celts when they got into Scotland and Ireland, who were then called Gomerites. Magog founded those that from him were named Magogites, but who are called by the Greeks Scythians. So by the time of the Greeks and by the time Josephus is writing, Magog is a region known as Scythia to the Greeks. It is Josephus who has identified Magog with a people the Greeks called the Scythians. The Greeks called the uncivilized nomadic tribes and people north of the civilized Mesopotamian world Scythians. So for the Greeks, the nomads north of civilized world, Mesopotamia, this was the Scythians. I don't know how to spell the word. S-C-Y, Scythians. A generic term for all this nomadic group that are all the way across here into China, coming across the steppes of Russia, into Europe, and so forth. The domestication of crops and animals, which led to the birth of cities and of civilization, culture, occurred first in this temperate central zone of Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean world, and it spread horizontally westward and eastward across the globe into the Mediterranean world and eastward then into India and on into China. Northern nomadic tribes outside the temperate warm zones frequently raided the farms and cities to the south for food, livestock, wives, weapons, tools, and plunder. The Scythians represented the same threat to the Greeks and the Mesopotamians that the Vikings and the Norsemen did to Western Europe later. The Scythians, that is Gog and Magog, came to represent a cultural threat to the civilized world, to the stability, the cultural stability and world view of the civilized world. The uncivilized tribes lived north of Mesopotamia, here, north of the Caucasus Mountains, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea at this time, north of the Danube River that's going to run here, golly, and the Danube's going to run here from the Black Sea, I think, or close all the way through here, above Greece, Italy, all the way over to almost to France. North of that, after his death, Alexander became associated, known as the defender of civilization against the barbarians from the north. One of the early accounts of Alexander, the folk epic, the Greek Alexander Romance, tells the story of Alexander's father, King Philip, sending Alexander's and his army to defeat the Scythians. One version of the romance preserves a story of how Alexander separated a group of people from the rest of humanity, shutting them out behind the Caspian gates. How he blocked the Scythians from coming into the civilized world. The Caspian Gates, also known as the Gates of Alexander, blocked a pass at Derbent, Russia, or the Pass of Dariel between Russia and Georgia. The legend says Alexander blocked the pass with elaborately wrought gates, oiled with a special non-flammable solution. Now, these fortifications were designed to block the uncivilized tribes of the north, traditionally identified as Gog and Magog, from invading the civilized regions of the south Mesopotamia region. A similar story, by the way, of fortifications to block Gog and Magog is found in Al-Kahf, the cave, the 18th chapter of the Muslim Quran. It's a widespread identity. The Jewish historian Josephus tells of an attack of a northern barbarian tribe he calls the Alans, who entered through Alexander's gates after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This occurred then in the lifetime of Josephus. Some northern barbaric tribe has come through Alexander's gates, and the commencement this happened between 70 AD and the siege of Masada in 73 AD. I keep wanting you not to take my word for it. I keep giving you in that manual that you have the primary sources and information so you can read it for yourself. I'm not inventing this. I don't think that you think I'm inventing it, but I want you to be able to be completely on rock-solid foundation, understanding what it is we are saying. Quoting Josephus, "Now there was a nation of the Alans, which we have formerly mentioned somewhere as being Scythians." Aha! You've got Gog and Magog, the Greeks now call Scythians, and Josephus is now calling the Scythians Alans. You got it? Gog and Magog, that area is called by the Greeks Scythians, and now Josephus is calling them Alans, and is telling us something that the Alans, that is the Scythians, that is Gog and Magog, did sometime between 70 and 73 AD. This nation, somewhere, which I've mentioned somewhere, inhabiting at the lake Meotis, this nation about this time laid a design of falling upon Media. That's going to be here on the edge of Persia and Babylon, modern-day Iraq, and the parts beyond it, in order to plunder them with the intention that they made a treaty with the king of Hyrcania. Remember the name King of Hyrcania. We will mention him later. For he was the master, the guardian of that passage which King Alexander the Great shut up with iron gates. This king, Hyrcanian king, gave Gog and Magog permission to come through the gates, and they came in great multitudes and fell upon the Medes unexpectedly, plundered their country, which they found full of people, and they replenished with abundance themselves with cattle, while nobody made any resistance against them. For Peiroas, the king of the Medes, had fled away for fear into places where they could not easily come at him, and had yielded up everything he had to them, and had saved his wife and his concubines, and that with difficulty, since they had been made captives, and it cost him 100 talents for their ransom. These Alans therefore plundered the country without opposition and with great ease, and proceeded as far west as Armenia. We have Armenians who are members of the parish here at St. Elijah, remnants of the great nation of Armenia that was destroyed by the Ottoman Turk Muslims in 1920s. Armenia, here, across here, the Alans, the Scythians, the Gog and Magog, laying everything waste in front of them. That Terates was king of that country, who met them and fought them, but had like to have been taken alive, almost was taken alive, for a certain man threw a net over him from a great distance, and had soon pulled him to the guy. And unless this king had taken out his sword and chopped the net away and ran away to escape. So the Alans, the Scythians, Gog and Magog, being still more provoked by this sight, laid waste the country, and drove a great multitude of the men and a great quantity of other prey they had gotten out of both kingdoms along with them, and they retreated back to their own country. We have here a raid of great consequence of a group of marauders from Gog and Magog pouring through the gates of Alexander in the mountain pass to come here out of the north into Mesopotamia and across Mesopotamia, and then drive it all backward through the gates to escape back north through the pass in the mountains. Of course, Alexander had never been to these mountains, which we today call the Caucasus, and obviously did not build any gates there. However, Alexander's encounter, which did occur in his lifetime, with the Amazon queen that occurred in Hyrcania. We just mentioned Hyrcania, the king of which is mentioned by Josephus in that passage. The point, of course, is that Alexander's name became associated with the mountain range between the Caspian and Black Seas in that first generation after his death. A gate or fortification obviously existed there to block the main passage over and across the ridge, the Dario Pass. It existed at least by the time of Josephus. But by the time of Josephus, it was called Alexander's Gates. In addition to Josephus, who's writing then in the 73, 83, 93, we said, 93 AD, The Roman Emperor Nero, who's emperor in the 60s, near the end of his reign in 68 AD, planned a campaign against the Alans, against the Scythians, against Gog and Magog, of which Josephus speaks of years later. I don't know why that says 5 years. It was a lot later than 5 years when he wrote the Antiquities. He summoned troops from Germania, that is Nero, Britannia, Illyricum, and conscripted a new legion of tall Italians, lads of 6 feet or more, for the purpose of this war. Nero did, and he called this legion the Magni Alexandri Phalanx. The what? Great Alexandrian Phalanx army. This is the point. In the 1st century AD, over 300 years after Alexander's death, it is Alexander and his gates that are understood to be standing between the civilized world of the Roman Empire and the uncivilized, marauding barbarians, Gog and Magog, north of Mesopotamia, north of Greece, north of Italy, north of what we today call France. Those barbarians north of the mountains all across Asia and Europe that are here, north of the Alps, north of all of these mountain ranges that are here. It is Alexander and his gates that became the symbol against those who are threatening civilization. Those who destroy or seek to destroy the civilized world were north of the civilized world, and it was Alexander the Great and his gates that became the symbol of standing against Gog and Magog, against the collapse of culture and civilization. Alexander and Gog and Magog. Now let's turn to Alexander in the prophet Daniel. Again, we are interested in the Jewish understanding of the movement of history as a movement of God in history, as they understood that movement of God in history in the 1st century AD when John wrote his Apocalypse. What events helped create this Jewish apocalyptic and heightened sense of an impending apocalyptic and eschatological time, end of time? What was going on that created this heightened sense that the 1st century was coming to close to the end of time? Again, we shall rely heavily on Jewish scholar Ori Amitay to guide our discussion. Second Temple Judaism, First Temple dating back to Solomon, being destroyed by the Babylonians. Second Temple Judaism dates from 516 BC, when the Persian Cyrus and the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of that temple, all the way from 516 to 70 AD, when Jerusalem was destroyed and that second temple, it had been enlarged by Herod, but it was still the same temple period, would be destroyed by the Romans. You see, for over half a millennium, 500 years, from 587 and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Babylonians, that had been followed by that 70 years in captivity, and the rebuilding, then being liberated by the Persians after 70 years, returning and rebuilding Jerusalem and the temple in 516, only to have it all. I know, timeline is important. If I can, and I want to put it on here, coming backwards like this. I know it's backwards, but if you have 586 BC, the temple, Jerusalem, is destroyed, and the Jews are going to be taken captive. We're now in Babylon, down here, till 516. They get to come home and start again until 70 AD, and Rome wipes them out again. That's a period here of rebuilding and being in Jerusalem at the temple since 516 plus 70 AD. That's 586 years the temple has stood, and Jewish history has been continued and lived out during the Second Temple period. Within this framework, at last 500, beginning here in 586, going all the way here, that's over what, 656 years. The Jewish historians, the Deuteronomists, within that framework, will begin to develop an eschatological, apocalyptic understanding of the end of time. It develops during that time. It begins that history that eventually, after the collapse, the coming of Persia, it's happening. It is this apocalyptic beginning, this sense of it's headed towards an apocalyptic, cataclysmic end, the final battle where God wins and Israel is at peace. Alexander the Great's involvement in Jewish eschatology is not limited to his special position vis-a-vis Gog and Magog and his gates. In fact, he plays a key role in the most influential piece of apocalyptic eschatological literature produced by Second Temple Judaism, the Book of Daniel, according to this Jewish historian. Let's look at some parts of the vision, the Book of Daniel, vision number 1, Daniel chapter 2. The Book of Daniel takes place in Babylon. Daniel was one of the Israelites taken captive to Babylon in 586, taken to Babylon. He served in the court of the Babylonian king, King Nebuchadnezzar. The king had a dream which he could not remember. After others had failed, Daniel not only told the king what his dream was, but also what the dream meant. In his dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a huge statue with different parts made of different materials. This is the interpretation of the king's dream. I've actually printed for you in your manual Daniel chapter 2, beginning in verse 31. If you don't have the manual, you can find your own Bible. Turn to the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 31. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and clay. You watched while a stone was cut without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them to your hand, and he's made you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold, but after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, the one with silver, which shall rule over the earth, and the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. And as you saw iron mixed with clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and the interpretation is true, sure. Now, this is the Jewish scholar. Daniel interprets the dream easily. The golden head stands for King Nebuchadnezzar himself. He's followed by three other kingdoms of decreasing worth. That much is obvious from the metals used to define them, until the rock finally puts an end to the story, or rather to history, forever and ever. Given the origin of the book of Daniel and the kingship it recognizes, the historical picture is rather clear. Gold stands for Babylonia, silver for Media. The Medes were here on the edge of Persia. We could talk about the Medes and the Persians. They will conquer, Persia will conquer them and create a single country going by Persia, but also known as the Medes and the Persians. Silver for Media, bronze for Persia, and iron for Macedonian rule. This last is to be followed by God's kingdom, which at an unspecified time in the future is to encompass the entire world and last for all eternity. Remember, we are seeking to understand these events as it was understood by Judaism in the first century AD, as opposed to how the book of Daniel is understood from a Christian perspective today. Version 2, I say Christian, some, particularly those Bible scholars or scholars of biblical prophecy, as they understand the book of Daniel in their own minds today. That was vision number 1. Let's look at a second vision found in Daniel. Daniel chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, it's another king, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while in bed. He wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The 4 beasts are in turn a lioness, a bear, a leopard, and a terrible beast that was exceedingly different from all the beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. The introduction of the 4th beast is followed by a vision of the Ancient of Days. We've had the 4, and now that was in 7 verses 1. Now we come to chapter 7, verse 9. I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was sealed and the books were open. I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking. I watched till the beast was slain and its body destroyed and given to the burning flame. As for the rest of the beast, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. The Jewish scholar continues, the identity of the 4 kingdoms is the same as the first vision, but here we have a greater emphasis upon the Hellenistic 4th kingdom that was stranger and more terrible than its predecessor. This beast is worse than the others. This vision also contains allusions to the actual history of the Hellenistic period down to the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Daniel 7:8, I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots, and there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. it had been or was Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, whose slaughter of a pig on the altar of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, as well as the twice daily pagan sacrifices offered there, is called the Abomination of Desolation 3 times in Daniel. Daniel 9:27, chapter 11:31, chapter 12:11. It was this abomination of desolation that led to the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucid Greeks. The atmosphere in this vision is one of great crisis. Terrible things are afoot, and a day of judgment is near. Although no particular date is given in the vision, a final change in world history is promised, which will put rule in the hands of the people of the sacred ones above. Vision 3 in Daniel chapter 8 is the vision of the ram and the goat. Like the second vision, the third vision also occurred during the reign of Belshazzar, who was either the son or the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar was the last king of Babylon when Babylon was defeated by, Cyrus and the Persians. In the third year of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one who appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and so it happened, while I was looking, that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Uli. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will, and he became great. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken. The large horn in the middle of this goat, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of these little horns came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host, some of the stars to the ground, and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the Prince of Hosts, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, "How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed." Wow, you remember when we first started and our first episode together, we created some arbitrary, artificial, apocalyptic paragraphs, political paragraphs, one of which, if I remember, had to do with the bombing of the two towers in New York City on 9/11. We knew what it meant because we were alive when it happened. We have no clue what all this means in our own life, from our own experience, but those who were alive knew exactly what it all meant. We shall talk about it in a minute. Then a vision of a man stood before me. I heard the voice of this man say, "Gabriel, cause that man to understand the vision." So here we come. Daniel 8:19. And he said, "Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be. The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia," the two kingdoms, the Persians. "And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece." Persia had conquered Mesopotamia, Turkey, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. It came west and north and southward in the first vision we just looked at. The male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. That would be Alexander. As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall rise out of the nation, but not with power. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and he shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. And the vision of the evenings and the mornings, which was told, is true. Seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. We're talking about then Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who would then take over the sacrifices in the temple and require all the Jewish people to begin to eat pork. The Jewish scholar continues, the meaning of the dream revealed to Daniel by a human-like figure which appears out of nowhere, the horned ram, which you have seen is the kings of Media and Persia, and the hairy satyr is the king of Greece, and the great horn between its eyes is the first king. This first king is thus Alexander. The breaking of the horn signifies the division of his empire after his death. After Alexander's death at age 33, his 4 generals, the 4 little horns, divided up his empire among them. Ptolemy the first in Egypt, Seleucus the first in Asia, Asia here referring to Mesopotamia, Lysimachus in Asia Minor, that would have been Turkey, and Cassander in Macedonia in Greece. Well, then, understanding Daniel from a Jewish perspective, understanding Alexander, it represents the last stage of human history. Without going into many riveting questions posed by the book of Daniel, one can easily and readily agree about one aspect of the book's historical outlook. The Hellenistic age, inaugurated by Alexander and continued by his successor of kings, is perceived as the last stage before the day of reckoning and the dawn of God's kingdom. The age of Alexander, the age of the kingdoms after him, is the last stage of human history before the coming of God's kingdom. The Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in 586, deported the people to Babylon. Cyrus of Persia defeated the Babylonians, permitted the Jews to return and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple in 516. They had lived in relative peace until the time of Alexander. Following Alexander's death and the division of his empire, his generals fought each other for control of the whole. There was a total of 6 Syrian Wars fought between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies between 274 and 168 BC. We're close to the birth of Christ, within 168 years. The 4th and 5th Syrian Wars, which ended with the transfer of power in Israel from Egypt to the Seleucid Syria, must have been a nasty shock after the relative stability that the 3rd century BC had been for the Jews. Following the religious confrontations of the reign of Antiochus IV, the situation reached a fever pitch. The Jewish scholar continues, a sense of change was in the air. And at this point in Jewish history, as in many others, the result was the outbreak of apocalyptic, eschatological, and messianic activity. This outbreak of end-time calamity, apocalyptic and eschatological and messianic history occurred at the time of the Antiochus IV, this change in the air that now came when the Seleucid Greeks now controlled Palestine and the Jews. The perception of Alexander, I'm continuing, the Jewish scholar, the perception of Alexander as the instigator of the last stage before the Messianic age, based on his role in Daniel, became a staple in Jewish eschatology of later generations. This is key. It was this understanding that Alexander the Great had initiated the final end of history that shaped especially the apocalyptic, eschatological, and messianic expectations of the first century AD. It was those sense of living at the end times, the inaugurated by Alexander, that even created the invention of apocalyptic liturgy in the first place. That Alexander had initiated the end of time shaped Jewish expectations in many ways, two of which were, number one, the belief that prophecy had ceased, and number two, that Alexander himself had the role of being the instigator of the eschaton, the end of time. Let us consider each of these two results or new expectations. Alexander the Great and the end of prophecy inside Judaism in at least a century before the coming of Christ, if not 2 centuries. Again, we shall make use of Jewish scholar, historian Amitay to guide us into Jewish thought. Alexander plays a prominent role in relation between the inevitable march of history and the principle of prophecy. Prophecy has played a distinctive and crucial role in Israelite history from its earliest beginnings, the earliest beginnings of Israelite history, the earliest beginnings of prophecy within that history, unto the present time. It is thus hardly surprising that it too was subjected to the evolutionary process of natural selection, which caused it to change and adapt in nature and practice. The concept and practice of prophecy changed. He continues, what concerns us here is a major shift in the history of Israelite prophecy during that Second Temple period from 516 BC to 70 AD, that 586-year time, whereby at the end of a long and gradual process, prophecy had ceased to be regarded as a legitimate means of communication with the Almighty. The final stage of this process was formulated by Rabbi Yossi ben Halafta in his treatise, the Seder Olam. Now, this treatise was composed in the second half of the 2nd century. It'd be 150 to 200 AD. It was edited about the middle of the 3rd century AD. It attempts to create a unified chronology based on information gleaned from the books of the Bible, the Jewish Old Testament, the only Bible the Jews would have. Continuing, quoting Amitay, this work is cited widely in later rabbinic literature and otherwise commands great authority. In fact, its established chronology underpins the Jewish dating system in current use within Judaism. Interesting, the end of prophecy is given a date by Rabbi Yossi that is concurrent with the arrival of Alexander the Great. The relevant passage is worth quoting in full. It's probably in Hebrew. I'm glad the author translated it into English for us. And the shaggy hair satyr, king of Greece, is the first king. And there stood a hero king, and as he stood, his kingdom broke. He is Alexander the Macedonian, who ruled for 12 years. Until that time, the prophets had prophesied with the Holy Spirit. The Jews understand that to say that after Alexander the Great, prophecy had ended or occurred no more. Needless to say, the synchronization offered in this Jewish document, Seder Olam, was made in retrospect and should be interpreted accordingly. The practice of prophecy did not stop, actually, in the 330s BC, and the statement of Rabbi Yossi would have made little sense to the contemporaries of Alexander's. That comment is from Amate. Nevertheless, Jewish sources dating from the Hellenistic phase of the Second Temple period testify to the belief that the legitimacy of prophecy had somehow lapsed after Alexander, and it would be renewed in a future unspecified time. In the late 140s BC, the Seleucid king Demetrios II approved the last surviving Macedonian brother. The Macedonians had led the revolt against Antiochus and the Greeks. Their last name, they became known as the Hasmoneans. Simon was the last of the Maccabean brothers, and the Seleucid king will appoint Simon to be the high priest in Jerusalem, the beginning of the government proclaiming the priest in Jerusalem. This account occurs in the book of 1 Maccabees, which is in the Christian Old Testament. That's not the Old Testament of the Protestants, but that's an invented Old Testament of Martin Luther. The original Old Testament of the church that existed for 1,500 years before Luther and still exists inside the Orthodox Church. 1 Maccabees is in our Bible, and it says this, 1 Maccabees 14:41, "Thus the Jews and the priests were pleased that Simon should be their ruler and high priest forever, until a faithful prophet should arise." So by this time, in Palestine, inside Jewish literature, it is acknowledged prophecy is over. We're not told when previously it had stopped, but it is now over, and the Seleucids will name the high priest because there is no longer a prophet like Samuel to anoint the king, the high priest in this case. The assumption underlying this statement, again, this is Amate, is clear enough. Simon and his contemporaries lived in a time when true prophecy was utterly absent. To judge by the phrasing of this official document, he's calling it official document, by the way, because in the current Jewish Bible, there is no book of Maccabees. So it only exists in the Christian Old Testament, but he at least will call it an official document. The reemergence of true prophecy was an event expected to take place at an undetermined point in the future. When it resumed, it would also bring about a complete renegotiation of the existing order. Previously, in the early days, I know I've got to hurry. Previously, in the early days of Maccabean revolt, when Jerusalem had been reclaimed, the altar that had been defiled by the desecration of abomination was dismantled. They dismantled it. But the question arose of what to do with the defiled stones of the altar. They did not know how to deal with these most sacred objects, which had been rendered ritually unclean. The political answer to this complex situation, see, they've been consecrated. You can't just throw something consecrated away. The answer was we must wait. We must postpone making a decision to some unknown date in the future when a prophet will come, and the prophet will tell us what should be done. Then quoting Maccabees, 1 Maccabees chapter 4, verse 41 following, then Judas ordered his men to fight those in the citadel until he purified the sanctuary. He chose righteous priests devoted to the law. They purified the sanctuary, carried the defiled stones to an unclean place, and they discussed what should be done with the altar of whole burnt offerings, which had been desecrated. It seemed to them the best plan was to tear it down, so it would not be a reproach to them because the Gentiles had corrupted it. So they tore down the altar. They stacked the stones in an appropriate location on the temple hill until a prophet would come and tell what should be done with the stones. It seems like the same event is recounted from the rabbinic point of view in another document, a Jewish document, the Megillat Ta'anit, which is an early rabbinic work setting out a list of festive days. And it's going to give another version, a second telling of the same story. I'm not going to read it to you, but it refers to the Hasmoneans, the Maccabeans, and it says, and they found the precious stones which lie there to this very day, until Elijah will come and testify whether they are clean or unclean. The day they remove them, it is declared a festive day in Israel. I believe that day is Yom Kippur, when they dedicated the new altar and had replaced the old altar and placed the stones here. And they are waiting until Elijah comes, which begins the new expectation inside Judaism until this day, even at their feast of the Seder feast at Passover. I believe they have a wine cup set there in place of and in honor of for Elijah should he now come at this moment. Obviously, the details of this text differ from the direct text from Maccabees. What concerns us is the identity of the prophet. This is Amate speaking. The prophet that's destined to arrive and provide the answer is now none other than Elijah. The appearance of Elijah is not merely a matter of exegetical curiosity. His mention immediately calls to mind the final verses of the prophet Malachi, closing the end of biblical prophecy. Behold, I will send you Elijah before the coming great day and glorious day of the Lord. Furthermore, Elijah is also commonly seen as the precursor of the Messiah himself. This again is our point, and I'm coming close to our conclusion. The point is this: for the Jews, the coming of Alexander had inaugurated a new age, which also caused prophecy to cease. A new age, which he helped bring about, is destined to come to an end only with the return of Elijah and the coming of the Messiah. It will be Elijah who will be the prophet that returns and restores prophecy, announcing the presence and coming of the Messiah. Now, just as a quick aside, you can tell that we are extremely close to the documents, the four Gospels of the New Testament, and the Christian Jewish understanding, the Christian Jewish Messianic group's understanding of the role of John the Baptist in relationship to Jesus the Messiah. The theological and historical significance of the age inaugurated by Alexander in the visions of Daniel is like that which the historical legends ascribe to Alexander in the building of the gates of Alexander, protecting civilization from Gog and Magog. In both cases, Alexander stands at the threshold of a new era. In the first point, blocking and saving civilized history from the barbarians. And in the second instance, being now the one having inaugurated the last step of human history. That Alexander inaugurates the last stage before the Messiah receives its clearest elucidation in a Hebrew text as fascinating as it is little known, the Midrash of Ten Kings. It's Jewish. This text of unknown authorship set forth a list of 10 kings who have ruled or will rule the entire world. The Jewish list of the 10 kings: number 1, the sacred one, blessed is he who rules heaven and earth. Number 2, Nimrod, the founder of the kingdoms of Mesopotamia. Number 3, Joseph, who ruled in behalf of Pharaoh. Number 4, Solomon, the last of the united monarchy. 5, Ahab, great king of northern kingdom of Israel. 6, Nebuchadnezzar, ruler of the Babylonian Empire. 7th, Cyrus, conqueror of Babylon and deliverer of the Jews. The 8th king, Alexander the Macedon, conqueror of the world. The ninth king, King Messiah, the uncut stone, which destroyed the image, became a tall mountain and filled the earth. And the 10th king, the first king, is the last king. I am the first and the last, and except me there is no God. Isaiah 44:6. Well, that is quite a bit we've just come to. I don't know if you're ready to do any more. You're probably, if you're watching this at home live, you're exhausted and worn out. If you're watching it on video, you can, of course, stop this at any time. So we're going to stop at this point, and there's a possibility we will call it quits for today. So those of you who are watching us live after, almost an hour and 45 minutes, can take a break. And if we do stop at this point, that means that we will finish chapter 3 next week. And when we finish chapter 3, we're going to be brought again close to the New Testament period, just like we are now with the prophecy of the coming of Elijah and the Messiah being brought very close to the first pages of the New Testament. So God bless you for being part of us this day. And I apologize that I didn't stop 45 minutes ago and given all of us a break. So we'll stop here now, and I will see you again next week, God willing. Thank you. Be safe. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.